Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Multispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. Phone lines are open this hour to be part of the program. It is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Ovens. Welcome in, sir.
Good evening, Noah. How goes?
It has been an absolute, it's been a really long, busy week. I'm extremely happy to be home, but I had an absolute blast itself. How about you?
Yeah, you know what? It's a good time. I decided I was going to try and be more present at this one, and I think I accomplished that goal. Now, whether that was good or not, that's a different story.
Oh, I think it was good. So one of the things that you did was you kind of hosted a little mini hackathon, which I thought was really cool. Every once in a while, not every once in a while, this happens actually all the time itself and throughout various, you pick a corner of the room and this is happening somewhere in some hallway. But people are hacking on stuff. They're doing things, they're demoing things that they did at work, or they're getting familiar with newer things. So you took it upon yourself to bring hardware, which you so generously gave away, to demo Frigate. Now, if people aren't familiar with Frigate, it is a open source camera NVR, and you brought a small little gigabyte style or NIC style gigabyte PC and installed with a fresh version of Arch/Endeavor, hosted a Frigate hackathon. And as a part of that, you tried i3. So before we get into the Frigate stuff, I'm kind of curious, what was your thoughts of i3?
You know, I really liked it. I liked it better than I thought I would, and I would definitely consider it on a laptop. I don't know that I'd move over to a desktop. I'm not quite that sold yet, just because I really like the expose, which is when you flick your mouse up into the upper corner and have everything kind of display the thumbnails and stuff like that. I really like that. I know, So I'm not convinced that I would give that up, but I did really like i3 much more than I thought, and I definitely could see putting it on a laptop.
So we got you a monitor, we got you a keyboard, we got you a mouse, and you installed the operating system, and pretty soon you had a crowd of people, both camera professionals, IT professionals, and just general geeks, crowding around you to get Frigate set up. So typically people are familiar with using Frigate on Home Assistant. You, being Steve, said, we're going to read the documentation, we're going to grab these containers, we're going to set it up by hand. What did you think of the process of setting up Frigate, and what was your experience?
So I'll say this, that I didn't have to go to blogs or anything like that. So sometimes when you're considering a project, you end up doing some random person's blog or some tutorial or something like that, because you can't make heads or tails of the official documentation or things of that nature. That wasn't the case here. I did find myself bouncing around in various parts of the documentation, and there was another person that was doing it with me. He VPN'd into his house and was doing Frigate stuff at his house, and between the two of us, we found what we were looking for, but it wasn't as straightforward as I thought. So like you click on setting up the camera, and it just has a little description about the different resolutions that you might want to consider recording in your camera, for example. And that was not what I would expect. And we ended up finding the setup stuff in a different section of the documentation rather than where I thought it would be.
So this is where I think the real value in doing stuff like this at a self as opposed to at home in your mother's basement kind of a thing, right? Because it allows for the exchange of knowledge where you have the knowledge to say, I'm going to go do this by hand. I'm not just going to click on the add-on button. Somebody else is sitting there and saying, I have this set up at home. It's working there. So let's go take a look at that, compare and contrast. And then all of us that are sitting around learn from that experience. So after we got Frigate set up and working, how did it run?
Hard to say. I mean, we need to be fair to the project because the bricks, which is the gigabyte style NUC, is old. And the part of the reason why I had it was I retired it from, it used to be my Nextcloud server, and I decided that it was old enough. You have to consider life cycling hardware when it is, if you have the means, and it is hosting something of extreme value to you. And so I didn't find a problem with it in specific, but it's from the DDR3 era of stuff and decided to decommission it. So with that in mind, can you really judge the performance and stuff like that of a project when you're giving it subpar hardware? Not really sure.
Yeah, that's probably fair. Although I think we can have some takeaways. So for example, I won't bury the lead here, or I will bury the lead intentionally, but the CPU cycles dropped in half when we turned off the AI analysis thing, right?
Well, it was more than in half. So we were ending up pegging the CPU somewhere at 80% of the way when we were using a feature called detect. And that's when it was trying to figure out what was going on the screen. And that dropped right through the floor when we turned that off. And so, that's kind of to be expected. You've got an ancient CPU relative to all of this AI loveliness that gets put into everything. So, and not on... If I also consider the project itself, they have recommended an add-on called the Google Coral, which is kind of like it's a neural processing unit or whatever fancy word we want to say for an additional processing unit that plugs in via the USB, and they have it well supported, and it's supposed to offload all of that. So I didn't have that, and you knew that it was going to be a little rough when the project itself says, you can do this on the CPU, you probably don't want to.
Okay, that's fair. So they gave us fair warning. But we were able to get it up. It was working. It functioned. And we all got to see a live demo of Frigate. Does it have some room to grow? Sure. But the project is also kind of in its infancy. It hasn't been around that long. And it is absolutely one of the best UI-looking things for open source camera recording in Linux. So you got home, and I understand you took it a bit further. You got your feet wet at Self. What did you engage in once you got home?
So... I suppose it's important to note we couldn't get it to actually do any recording on the bare metal install, and none of us could figure out why. It kept complaining about making sure that you needed to have recording turned on in your configuration. We checked everywhere, and the guy that sat down and who had done it at home pulled up his config. We looked at it, like, aside from the camera name and like that kind of specific stuff, we could not find a difference, and his worked and mine didn't, and I couldn't figure out why. So I thought, well, they tout the fact that this was built for Home Assistant. So I came home and I thought, well, I'll try this. And I put it on Home Assistant, and my experience was much, much better installing it on Home Assistant as opposed to bare metal. So things worked exactly as they were documented. I still had the same problem, but being more familiar with the documentation this time around, it was a much quicker setup process.
Can you talk a little bit about how you set your cameras up specifically with dual streams?
With dual screens, you have to
dual streams. So in other words,
streams. Yeah. So the Reolink have the ability to have a couple of different streams. One where it's the full resolution, and one where it is a significantly downgraded resolution. And in the downgraded resolution, it also reduces the number of frames per second that it's capturing. And the idea is, if you want to record everything, maybe you want to record everything in a lower bit rate so that you're storing less data, so that your cameras can, ideally what happens is the camera will trigger on a motion event or some other defined event, and then the high recording kicks in. But absent that, if you're just recording all the time, you might want to have a lower bit rate so that you can have more storage. Like for right now, for example, one of the things I do like about Frigate is it will give you an estimate of how quickly you're burning your disk. And so currently I am using just over 1.5 gigs an hour for recording a single camera off of it. Because I ended up switching to the higher res stream because I honestly didn't find the low res stream for the recording very useful. It was I went back earlier in the day, and with the drop, it was 5 or 10 frames a second. So everything looked almost slideshowy. And on top of that, it was pixelated. So I didn't find that super useful. So I went and used the other stream that has a higher bit rate.
So this has opened up kind of a can of worms for you, because you started, when this discussion started, it was, hey, I have a system that's working for me via files uploading to an FTP and accessing the timeline via the local camera. Now your feet are wet, and inside of your Amazon cart is another box. Can you talk about the rabbit hole you've fallen down into?
Yeah. So I thought that I was just going to simply come through and install something in a VM. Even at, like, in the worst case scenario, I was going to have something running adjacent to Home Assistant and just having it record the streams. So my Home Assistant instance is currently running in a VM, and I have not done or needed to do any kind of pass through. And that is probably admittedly part of the problem, where there is no additional thing other than the CPU to help do any kind of offloading. So when I'm running it in Home Assistant currently, I have 4 core, well, it's technically 2 cores with 4 threads, and it's using 50% of my CPU just to record the single stream that I have. And I have 6 cameras, but as a test, I only put in 1. So running Frigate in a VM without doing any kind of pass through is somewhat problematic. And so I was considering, well, if I move this on top of my VM server, what does that buy me? And the answer was not much. A much newer, bigger CPU. I don't pass through a video card. Like, the VM server has the lowest of a low, like $20 NVIDIA card from ancient times, because I just needed the VM, like I needed it to turn on, and I've never needed a GPU. So I ended up with now I need to upgrade the box just so that I'm not burning because you can audibly hear the fan going all the time with the 4 cores spinning at 50%.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm even more concerned about my Home Assistant box kind of kicking the bucket early, because, it's somewhere between 6 and 7 years old, and now I'm spinning the CPU all the time. Now I'm a little concerned that I'm actually going to kill the thing before I'm ready to replace it.
Yeah, the rabbit hole.
Yeah,
the rabbit hole. Okay, so how about this, Steve? Now, understand this question is born out of ignorance, but could you attach the Google Coral thing via USB and pass that through to the VM, and would that alleviate doing all this on the CPU?
Absolutely. But the Coral, at least when I looked to be about $85. And so at that point, I don't know if the Coral would actually do the FFmpeg. So when you actually down to the low level, you see that it's actually FFmpeg that's pegging the CPU, because there's no hardware encoding. So I don't know that the Google Coral would do the encoding for me. It would buy me the detection offloading. So
I immediately distrust anything with the name Google in it. Well, I just do. So I went to Coral.ai. I can't immediately tell from their site, is the Google Coral just a physical device that I can plug in and do something, or is it actually somehow it says just USB accelerate? I don't know what that means. Does it use Google for anything? Does it call out to the cloud? Is it a local thing? What is it?
So to me, it looked like it's basically a neural processor on a USB stick. That's what it looked like to me. I didn't look to see whether it called home or anything like that. I don't think so, but I honestly can't say.
Okay, here would be my next question. If you're pushing, presumably if it's essentially a hack-on calculator, how much data can we push through the USB bus before we start to run into a bandwidth limitation of the USB bus?
That is a good question. I imagine that at least part of it would be how many streams you're feeding it. And I would have a maximum of 6, but honestly, I would pare that down to 4, because I probably wouldn't use any of the AI stuff in my chicken coop, which has 2 cameras. And I might consider not having it inside of the garage either, so I'd be down to 3 cameras at that point.
Interesting. I do see that they make M.2 accelerators too. I don't know enough about this to intelligently comment on it, but it's interesting nonetheless. Well, keep us abreast of how that process goes, and if you wind up replacing your Home Assistant box and what you wind up with an NVR.
Will do.
Our first email tonight comes in from Norm. Norm writes in and says, "Hi, Noah and Steve. This show is my weekly dose of great conversation. Keep up the good work. I have a self-hosted question around keeping in touch with your children. We live in a fairly small community. My children are quickly getting older. At around 8 or 9 years old, it's common for groups of friends to get on their bikes and travel around various activities, lakes, community center around town. Many parents get their kids a gizmo, SyncUp, or one of the many other brands available for kids' smartwatches in order to stay in touch. Being a self-hoster, I'm a bit leery of giving a random company my child's location at all times. But I can't seem to find any option for staying in touch with my children while letting them be free around town. Have you heard of other parents with creative solutions for this situation? For what it's worth, we're mostly interested in messaging. GPS is less necessary, but if we can't have messaging, we'd take the location as a trade-off. Thanks again, Norm." So, Steve, before we get to the direct answer to Norm's question, I kind of want to ask you broadly, what are your thoughts on, I'm going to phrase it like this, using technology as a way to help augment parenting, to help supplement parenting, as a tool for parenting?
That's a really tricky one. I don't like this question in general because being a libertarian, I don't like to project out onto other people, like stay in your own bubble. That's kind of my core ethos. Mm-hmm. But since you asked, statistically speaking, we're in a safer world than we were when you and I grew up. Between homicide rates and all of the rest of that sort of like violent crime has dropped, and we're talking significant drops. And so when I contrast that with the idea of like, oh, I need to keep tabs on my kid because I need to keep them safe, I suppose, but we all went through those times. And I guess you could argue, well, some of those bad things wouldn't have happened to some of those people if this technology was around. Yeah, perhaps. I default to a more how should I phrase this? I guess I default to a more hands-off approach of parenting. Just I don't like the idea of tracking. I don't like the idea of being tracked, and I don't like the idea that we should normalize it, right? And having said that, I'm not making a value judgment on anyone that is choosing to do so, as long as you're not chipping your children. Like, if once you get into that level, I actually have a problem with that. But
is that a thing? I've heard of chipping dogs. I guess I haven't heard of chipping children. Is that a thing?
Yeah, we'll park that for a more politically appropriate stage. But let's just say that we have an aunt in the family that thinks that that's the best way to go for kids in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm not on board with that. But absent that, I don't like it. I think that it sends the wrong message to children. But at the end of the day, we have to pick and choose which things we think is appropriate to expose our children to. And for me, that's not so much so. But if for you're playing the calculus and you say, you know what, I really think that I should expose my children to this because the trade-offs are worth it. If you've thought it through, you're an adult, and I support that decision.
So, okay. So if I were trying to address this, well, actually, I guess I have addressed this. So what we do in our family is my kids don't have phone numbers. Well, one of them does. Let me back up. So I refuse to be one of those parents that goes into the store and adds onto the quote unquote family plan to give my kids a phone. My kids can have a phone when they can save up, earn money, and pay for a phone subscription. Because A, it costs money. Nothing in life is free. But B, when you're paying for something, you're more careful with how you use it. If I'm paying for the data, right, then there's no harm in just racking up, sitting on YouTube all day. And I struggle enough just putting a rein on that in the house where they have Wi-Fi, let alone having them take it everywhere. So I guess I got to start there. If I woke up in your shoes and I were looking for a way to let my kids have contact, but not how do you say, not just have unfettered access to the internet. There's a couple of ways that you could go about doing this. So one way would be to use a service called JMP.chat SIM service. So they have a service. You go to JMP.chat, They started out as a bridge from SMS to XMPP. So they exposed phone numbers over XMPP as a privacy thing. Now, as of recently, they came up with a new system that is a SIM. So you can purchase a SIM from them, and what it does is it allows you only data, and it's $6.99 a gigabyte, so it's extremely expensive data. And then, but they charge you $5.50 for the year. That's $5.50 for the year. So if you buy this SIM, presumably for $5.50, if the only thing your kids are doing are sending messages, XMPP messages through jmp.chat, or texting you and your wife, you're going to pay $5.50 a year. So it's very expensive, and it could be approachable for a kid who is maybe doing dishes or something like that and getting paid 25 cents. So one of our kids chose to go down this route. She comes and she goes, hey, all my friends are texting. They're going back and forth. I want to do this. And I said, well, how much money do you make? She tells me. And I said, okay. So of that, what do you think a reasonable amount is for you to spend on a service so that you can text your friends? And so we kind of go back and we go through the budgeting thing, and that's what she does. She lets the dogs out and she cooks, and she does some things around the house to earn the money so that she can pay I think it's $5 a month for a JMP account. And then she pays the $5.50 a year so that she can use the SIM to get access to those messages on her phone. She can't browse YouTube. She can't stream. She could, but it's going to cost. She'd run the account down. And the other thing that they do that I really like from a kid standpoint, it doesn't allow you to just rack up a bill. So you got to put money in the pot, and then you drain the pot down. And when you get to the end of the pot, you got to put money back in. And I like that because it forces her to always be budgeting her money. She's got to save up the money first, put it in, then choose how much of it she wants to spend on this service, and then she can run it back down. And so it would be terrible for things like streaming video or streaming audio, really doing anything other than just messaging. So that's an easy, low friction way to get in there. Of course, we're not going to get out of a messaging question without me bringing up Matrix. So the nice thing about Matrix is it doesn't require a phone number. And so you can just sign up for an account, whether that's through matrix.org or you host your own family server because you don't want the traffic leaving there. Additionally, if you kind of want to lock the kids down a little bit more, you can turn on an option in the Synapse server that says don't let messages federate. That is to say, your kids can't message anybody outside of your family server, so they can maybe only get to you and mom. The third option I'm going to throw out there is Simplex. You can learn more at simplex.chat, and it's basically a messenger that has no user IDs. So it is completely anonymous. There is no user ID. There's no username. There's definitely not a phone number. There's not even random numbers. It's just a public-private key pair. And so you exchange the public-private key pair with the other person, and then you can send messages, and you alone would know who the person you're talking to because they're identified only by that private public key pair. So it's an incredibly private way to do messaging. Here's the downside to Simplex. It doesn't always work. And so it's a great idea in theory. I like the simplicity of it. I like the fact that it is based on crypto. I think all of that's great, but I've struggled to get it to work at times to where I'll generate a key pair and I'll try to exchange that key with somebody else, and we just can't establish a chat. But once you can get it working, it seems to work okay. So I'll have links for you for both a guide on, we have a how-to guide on setting up a Matrix instance if you're interested in doing that. Of course, I'll have a link for you to matrix.org, jmp.chat, their data plan, and Simplex chat. We'll have all of that for you in the chat, in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of June 9th, 2024, here's the Linux and open source news. Firefox 127 is now available. KDE has announced the release of KDE Frameworks 6.3. Canonical releases Ubuntu Core 24 for IoT, Edge, and embedded devices. Alma Linux now supports the Raspberry Pi 5. Security-oriented distro Parrot OS 6.1 has improved Raspberry Pi support with its latest release. Blend OS 4 has been released. The project claims it's Arch Linux, but made immutable, declarative, and atomic. The OBS team has announced the release of OBS Studio 30.2 beta, which brings native NVENC encoding support on Linux. In open source AI news, Meta open sources Megalodon. an LLM for efficient long sequence modeling. Stability AI, known for its AI art generator Stable Diffusion, has announced Stable Audio Open, a free open source model for creating short audio clips. Stable Audio Open allows users to generate high-quality audio samples for sound design. It creates clips up to 47 seconds long using simple text descriptions.
Have you ever wanted to store something on a disk, but you wanted the hard drive to be as fast as humanly possible? Maybe you have an older computer that is spinning Rust and it's just painfully slow to get anything done, but you got to keep using that computer for one reason or another. Have you thought about building a hard drive in RAM? That's exactly what a program called Tiny RAM Disk does. Tiny RAM Disk is a RAM drive functionality that can significantly benefit older computers with slower hard drive speeds for read-write operations and move to RAM. Therefore, depending on the particular computer, the user may experience up to 10 times more of a productivity boost. Quote, high file operation speeds are crucial when a user puts heavy I/O on the file system. RAM disks not only provide for better read-write speeds, but also takes the stress out of the hard drive, which increases the life expectancy. So they've got a number of different scenarios that are outlined here that you can use it for. One is working with very large projects or integrated development environment IDEs. The other is running computational analysis of numerous small size files. One of the things I think is particular, there's a couple utilities that do things like this, and frankly, with some of the caching that's in the Linux kernel, this kind of happens for you on modern systems. But one of the things that I think is kind of cool is it automatically brings it back on boot. And so they've got utilities in there where you can restore your RAM disk. It'll save it to the disk and it restores it back into RAM on boot. So if you're following along, essentially you have a readable, writable drive. It presents to the system as a drive, but actually it's not storing to the storage drive. It's storing to RAM. And then when you power the computer to off, it saves the RAM drive to your disk so that you can restore it in the future. Steve, have you ever played with RAM disks? Is there anything that interests you, or do you look at it and say, it's hard enough to saturate an M.2, I'm not interested?
No, I've played around with RAM disks for sure. I haven't played around with this one, and I'd be curious to see what impact it has on shutdown and or hibernation or sleep modes. Thinking about laptops and stuff like that. If you go to shut down and it has to do a sync between the RAM disk and the hard drive, does that mean that your shutdown now takes 3 minutes?
Ooh, good point. Yeah, I suppose it would, because it'd have to save that entire RAM. Everything you've changed has to get copied from RAM and then written to disk. Although the counter argument to that is, at least I can get all my work out of the way. I can get done. I can fire the power off command, and then I can go and grab myself a cup of coffee, grab myself some good dinner, and it can just do its thing as it powers itself off. Don't care as long as I don't have to sit there. It's better than all the time. All that time is time that I would have spent in between operations, right?
I suppose so. I was thinking of a laptop use case, which is where I would think this would be the most likely used, because if you've got a desktop, likely you could do something. Most desktops can take more than one hard drive. And even an old SATA SSD is going to be light years past the, like a mechanical one. So I was thinking the primary use case is a laptop where you might not be able to add a second hard drive and you don't want to go through or can't replace the operating system drive, for example. Then if you're hitting the shutdown, like I'm thinking about, okay, I've got to go. I'm leaving a work situation. Hit shutdown. Okay, guys, I'll be there in 5 minutes. Or some similar thing.
And now you're just waiting. Well, if you, the listener, check this out, you can learn more at github.com/the username/tinyramdisk. We'll have a link for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. But if you're looking for a way to play with a RAM disk, this is a nice way to do it. What do you think makes for a good presentation? When you attend conferences like Southeast Linux Fest, Scale, Linux Fest Northwest, Texas Linux Fest, Ohio, what do you go for? What do you look for in a presentation? Is that the title that catches your eye? Once you sit down in the presentation, what do you want from the speaker? Steve and I have put an effort into trying to get out to conferences and do a lot of speaking. Now, Steve has taken it to the nth degree. He's done almost a forensic level investigation into what you as the listener want to hear when you sit down into a presentation. He's looked at the psychology. He's looked at the art and the visual aspect of a presentation, and he's come up with some really interesting takeaways. So, Steve, You and I both presented at Self. You did 3 talks. I did 2 of them. What were some of the aspects that or guiding principles that you used as you put together your talks?
So first of all, I'd like to say that I don't get to tread on my cachet like Noah does. Everybody comes to hear Noah because of Noah, and that just adds a certain level of fallback, right? You don't have to have as good of a presentation layer when people are there because they like your personality or you're well-known person and they respect your opinion and stuff like that. Like I'm happy to play second fiddle to Noah on the Ask Noah show or wherever I needed to provide help, right? But failing that, so I have to fall back on, let's say, gimmicks. And so for me, the presentation layer is superbly important. So yes, the content is important and it has to be interesting, but I start looking at things like, what are you actually going to remember out of this? How does your memory work? How can I most likely give you cues? So if you're looking back over a presentation that I've done, how can I get you to remember what I've said without making my presentation a giant essay? So one of the things that you can do is make it visually interesting. And this is really important. A lot of people will just slam a wall of text up there and kind of read off of it. And though even the people that don't read off of it, they use it almost like script cues. And there is something to be said for doing that, interleaving that, right? Because it gives you a brain break as a person in the audience where you don't have to be listening as closely because the important or salient points are up on the screen already. But you don't want an entire presentation about that. If you're going to go ahead and put text up on the screen, you need to consider things like the contrast. So the way that your brain works is that you actually will remember the lightest things first, which means that a traditional presentation where you've got a white background and black text, you're setting yourself up for some level of failure because the white is what your brain is attracted to. So if you flip it and give yourself, you don't have to have a black background, but a dark black background with a high contrast text, if you're going to go with text, that is going to help the people absorb the information off the slide. It reduces strain off the eyes. It helps your brain focus on the right thing. And I'd like to point out a few things where you can see this in action. If you've ever seen when people are trying to draw your attention to something, the most effective way is they take, let's say, a screenshot and they dull everything around the screenshot except what's important. And that draws you right to that section, right? It's almost as if they've made that section brighter, but they just make the rest of it dimmer. And that helps you focus. And so you use these principles to help focus your audience. On top of that, you want to go unscripted as much as possible, unless you're a very well practiced public speaker. And the reason for that is because a lot of times when you script things too heavily, if you miss something, you will consciously go and realize you've missed it, and then the audience realizes you missed it. Otherwise, they don't know. The audience is not going to know, absent of I skipped a bullet point, that you've forgotten to tell them something that you wanted to tell them. So I've seen this a bunch of times where people will get themselves, they basically trip over their own feet in the presentation because they say something out of order, or they've said something and then realize that they were going to say it 2 sentences later because they've scripted it. And so unscripted presentations often come across better in the long run. It depends on your audience and the subject matter, but as a general rule, I think unscripted is a reasonable approach. When you're talking about trying to engage with the audience, the other thing that you should think about is if you can break up your presentation in some fashion, such as live polls are super popular. People love to give their opinion. And it doesn't matter if they're wrong. They also like to laugh at how many people got the question wrong, especially if it's like an anonymous poll. So it also gives you a way to interact with the audience. For example, I ran a poll and one of the options, which was the absurd option, was hire Red Hat. And nobody selected that. And so I called that out. And the audience had a really good laugh about the fact that nobody picked hire Red Hat as the option for answering one of the questions.
Until you said it. And then somebody did pick it. and then you thank them because it was something that you could bring back to your boss, which added another comedic element to the presentation.
Exactly, right? And so it really helps to engage with the audience. And on the idea, what that does is it gives you a brain break. Sometimes I'm really good at building in the brain breaks, and sometimes I forget. Like, I get so focused on trying to relay the information that I want them to get out of the presentation that I don't think to build in brain breaks. So if you forget to build in brain breaks, sometimes a strategic pause will make sense. Sometimes it comes across weird, and sometimes it comes across thoughtful. And so it takes some skill. Like, I don't know if you remember, Noah, but there were times where I walked off to the side of the podium and I didn't say anything while I was walking. And then I stopped and then I started. And that's just a subtle way that first you're giving the impression that you're really being thoughtful, and you probably genuinely are, right? If you're trying to get the information across, but it also gives the person like a chance to absorb a little bit. So on that, my last kind of suggestion here before I hand it off to Noah is video clips that are well placed are a good thing, and they break up the presentation. Now, you don't want to have them all over the place, but the ability for someone in the audience, if you got like a long presentation, an hour or more, breaking it up by having video or audio clips so that they don't have to just hear your voice gives you a break and gives them a break, and gives you an ability to interact with your audience in a different way.
So one of the things, if you've ever watched a game show like Password or Jeopardy, it's been said about those shows that a Martian could watch for 30 seconds and figure out what the rules are, right? Because it's so simple and it's so obvious that it draws everybody into the game show immediately. And the reason for that is because it's kept simple. So anybody, even if they have no experience, can walk in and immediately pick up what's going on. I have been to presentations where I'll sit through the first 15 minutes and I still don't know what we're talking about, or I still haven't figured out why I care or what that has to do with my life. And so I think making it simple and making it interesting can be kind of a challenge. One of the things that you can do is make the very first thing that comes out of your mouth a question, which includes the word you or your, and ideally feel. Because what that's doing is it's starting from where your audience is, and then it's starting in their world, and then you're bringing them into your world. And so you think about it like this, right? You announce your talk. You say, I'm giving a talk on X, it doesn't matter what the topic is, XYZ, and I'm going to be here at this time. You've created a listening appointment for somebody to come meet you. So they're sitting in that room because they want to hear something that you have to say. Once you have that listening appointment, you have to remember you are competing for mental attention, right? Life is going 70 miles an hour plus for most people. They're thinking about groceries. They're thinking, particularly at a fest, they may be away from work, and so they may be being pinged by people that are at work. They may be being pinged by their friends. If you're giving a presentation right before lunch, they may be thinking about food. They may be sleep deprived. They may have, if you have a party, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you might have people that are hungover on Saturday morning. Any of those could be a possibility, right? And so you're competing for all of that in mental space. And that's all competing with what you're saying. So people aren't going to necessarily remember what they don't hear. And so if they've tuned out because they're busy with other things, you've lost the ability to speak into their life. And so start from their world, move into yours. Figure out what it is they care about, and then relate your presentation to that, because you're competing for scarce attention. And so if you can engage them, if you can provoke their opinion, if you can get them to interact or participate, all of a sudden, without them even realizing it, they're not paying attention to the coworker that's saying, hey, when you get a check, I need you to do that. So hold on a second. He said something. I do have an opinion about that. I do care about that. That's exactly the problem that I'm having. How did he say, how's he going to solve this? Right. And now you have them hooked. Now the fish hook is in their mouth and you can take them places. I'm stealing this from Holland Cook's. Holland Cook is a consultant who works with talent to go in and give interesting talks and that sort of thing. And he says there are 4 things that people care about above all else. And they are whatever blocks people's path, whatever blocks people's children, whatever threatens people's wallets, whatever threatens people's health. Any one of those 4 things will immediately trump everything else under the sun. And then everything else becomes a secondary topic. And so if you can find a way to say, I'm going to tell you how you can install this system and cut your IT budget in half. Instantaneously, you have everybody's attention. If you say, I'm going to demonstrate a system that's going to help keep your kids safe, instantly you have their attention. If you're able to say this particular app or this particular way of doing things is going to help you avoid a heart attack, instantly you have their attention. Whatever it is, those 4 things ultimately is what we care about. And if you take something else and you say, but no, I don't go there for that. I go there so I can learn about an automation system or alerting so that I can. Why? You want to learn about alerting because you want time with your kids or your family, because you want to stay employed. And when you have a lot of tickets that come in and there are problems that break, it is frustrating to you and ultimately will cost you your job if you're not able to resolve them. So there's a level of stress that goes with it. But the reason that you're at that job, aside from the fact that you're probably called to do some of these things and feel like you're a technical steward, those things is money, right? People work for money. And so if you can find a way to start from the premise that people are at that job primarily because they want to be employed, they want to make money, you work your way backwards of, well, this is going to block their path. They're not going to be able to get home. They're not going to be able to leave the office because they can't leave until this thing is solved. Instantaneously, you have everybody's attention because they care about that. And so understanding those 4 things, path, children, wallet, health, everything else is second. If you can start there and then work your way backwards, that's where your audience is starting from. Everybody in that room is focused on one of those 4 things or all 4 of those things. And so if you can start there and then drill your presentation backwards, you're much more successful at getting their attention and driving the fish hook into their mouth. The last thing that Steve and I kind of wanted to talk about is the concept of a good audience. So anytime you're public speaking, you are putting yourself out there. You absolutely are, right? Because you're the person and all eyes are on you. And if things go well, it's kind of a wash, right? No news is good news. If everything goes well and everything's flawless, then nobody thinks poorly of you. If things go horrifically wrong, you will be the butt of every conversation, or at least a few of them. And the topic of conversation and the thing that people stick out is how terribly that demo or that thing or that whatever went. And that can be an intimidating experience. And so when you're going into a presentation, Steve and I are kind of curious, well, what do you want to see from those? But at the same time, we wanted to share some thoughts with what we're looking from you as an audience when you sit down there. So Steve, you said that in every one of your presentations itself, you kind of have a friend that follows you around.
So I neglected to get her name, but she's been at a bunch of my talks, and I look forward to having her in my audience. She's a dev, and she always tells me, oh, well, I don't deal directly with whatever it is that I'm talking at the time, but I'm curious about it. And she sits there, she smiles, and she nods her head, and there's a level of affirmation that you get. I also use her as a barometer to figure out if I'm explaining things properly, because I know that this is not the life that she lives, not the world she lives in. If I look at her, I can get a sense for how well am I explaining this to somebody who's interested, but might not have any particular knowledge in this in the subject. And I find that incredibly useful to have a face to bounce off of. And you'll notice that lots of speakers will do this. They will find faces in the audience and speak directly to those people as a way to engage and also keep a barometer on the rest of the audience, just to figure out how things are going.
I will tell you, for me, it's if you're coming to a talk, if you're coming to listen to me, listen to me. I get it. Not everybody learns or listens the same way. I'm one of those people. I have to have something else I'm doing or I can't pay attention. This was a major point of contention with my 3rd grade teacher. He's not listening to me. Yes, I am. I understand that it doesn't seem like I am because I'm fiddling with my pencil or twisting the thing or whatever, but I am. I am listening to you. In fact, if I just stare at you, I will daydream and my ADD will take off and I will be thinking about everything other than what you're saying. So trust me, you want me to be fidgeting. So this is not, I want to preface that by saying that I understand there are different learning styles. At the same time, if what I'm saying isn't of value to you, if it's not interesting to you, if you get 5 minutes in and you're like, yeah, I'm going to hack on my laptop or I'm going to go, just leave. Get up and leave. It's okay. And the reason I say that is because I am looking out at you to see when the eyes glaze over, right? A lot of times I'm hanging on a slide as I'm getting information out, but as I can see as I can see the eyes glaze over, as I can see heads start to drop down into laptops, as I can see, that's my sign. Okay, this is no longer valuable. Moving on. When the topic is dried up, it's time to abort, time to eject, time to get on to the next thing, right? And we want to keep the pace moving. And so I'm looking out at you to use you as a marker. If you've completely checked out and decided it's not for you, I know that there is this social thing about don't get up in the middle of presentations. I prefer it. I prefer that people just get up and excuse themselves or take off because, first of all, you're not getting anything out of it anyway. And second of all, you're a false indicator to me as to how I'm doing because you've checked out. So you're not listening. So it doesn't really matter. The second thing is ask questions. Ask questions. If you come into a presentation, if you're not getting the information, I sometimes I'll say this, if I get to the end of a presentation and I ask for any questions and there are none, the joke I always make is one of two things is true. Either I've done such an excellent job at presenting that you came in here with complete ignorance and now your mind has been filled and there is no question to be asked because I've answered it all. I'm that great. That's option one. Here's option two. I've done such a terrible job that I've lost all of you that none of you care. But there shouldn't, aside from those two extremes, it's a joke, kind of, but there's some truth in it, right? Aside from those two extremes, if I've done my job well at engaging you as an audience, as a person who's listening, there should be a question or two. There should be something that I said that triggered something in your mind's eye that went, I could see how that would work. I want to say that, make that work, but I don't understand this, or I don't understand how to make that connect to this. Something like that is the connection that I'm looking to make. And it's deeply concerning to me when I get to the end if there aren't any questions. That's my sign that things have not gone wrong. So as you're going along, I find this very useful. And I did this during Steve's talks. I take notes. As I'm going through, I'm writing down what I'm hearing, and then I'll write down questions. And Steve's really good. You're really good, Steve. You actually, I think, multiple times in your presentation, you're like, hey, I want you to get out of this what you want. So if you want to ask questions during, just raise your hand. I'm happy to pivot, that sort of thing. Sometimes if there's a question that I think is on point and on topic to what you're talking about, I'll ask it in front of everybody else. But in part because I have a relationship with you, but also even if I didn't, because I know the speaker's going to be around after, I'll just jot those questions down and I'll ask privately afterwards and I'll walk up and say, hey, could you answer a couple of questions? The third thing, get contact information. If you like what a speaker is doing, get contact information, find out where they work, find out well, maybe that's a bit too much, but find out what they're willing to share with you about where they work or what they do professionally, and pay attention to that person, because what that does is it allows you, it builds the community and the professional networking sphere, right? So I actually, there's a couple people that presented itself that I'd never met before, and I either attended a presentation or in one particular case, I missed the guy's presentation and later after the fact learned how much I wish I hadn't missed his presentation, and found him in the conference and I said, hey, could you sit down for a minute? I just want to pick your brain. I know you gave a presentation on this. I missed it, but I really want to learn what you have to say, and made a connection with him and got to know him a little bit and then got the information that I'm looking for. But now I've got that connection. So the next time I have a question about that particular aspect of the industry, I got somebody to go to. Anything else to add to good audience stuff, Steve?
Come out and just engage, right? So one of the things that I've noticed is that engaging with the presenter, especially when you know that they're not going to be thrown off by it, really changes the dynamic of the presentation for everybody, and often for the better, because your engagement will beget other people's engagement, right? It's almost like the first person to leave a party then makes it acceptable for everybody else to leave the party. It's kind of that in the reverse.
100%. We actually saw that at Self, where you'd have a different dynamic when somebody is doing something alone versus when they have the ability to have that engagement, and all of a sudden everything is more interesting and engaging and fun and exciting, and then the entire that energy kind of spreads. Yeah,
and so part of it is you have to know the person that's doing the presenting a little bit, and I don't mean at a personal level, but you get a read for whether they're nervous or whatever. And people who are obviously nervous probably are going to have a little bit of a hard time adjusting to people interacting with them because things are not going to plan. But if you have people that are obviously fluent or used to speaking in front of people, like Noah's really good at interacting with the audience and making people feel heard. That really can change the dynamic for everybody in a positive way.
The last thing I wanted to draw some attention to tonight, we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, in part because we don't have a lot of time to spend on it. You heard the announcement during the Newswire about BlendOS. Well, BlendOS is put out by a guy by the name of Rudra Srod. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And the thing that I think is so cool about Rudra is he is a friend and a mentoree of Simon Quigley, who works at Altispeed Technologies as a software developer and is also the release manager for Lubuntu, and I think Ubuntu now as well. Rudra's 14 years old. And he is in charge of not only BlendOS, but he's also in charge of the Ubuntu Unity spin. And I am humbled, I am shocked, I am surprised, I am elated that a 14-year-old kid has, in just a few years, got himself with the technical expertise that he's able to maintain a distro that, frankly, would be a challenge for some adults, let alone two distros. In the latest version, version 4 of BlendOS, is a fully declarative operating system based on Arch, and so it allows you to have any package or kernel drivers from the Arch repo or the AUR while still shipping pre-configured GNOME, KDE, XFCE, Mate, Budgie, etc. And so it's a cool distro. It's absolutely solving a problem. And it's being done by a very, very sharp young man. And so I think that's worth calling out. I think that serves as an inspiration to a lot of us, Steve.
Man, I don't even know if I was doing anything worthwhile at 14. Yeah, that's just incredible.
I was lucky. My accomplishment at 14 was I beat the game GoldenEye. And I was able to do that in 00 mode, as opposed to just agent mode or secret agent mode. And here this kid is releasing distros. Unbelievably cool. Music in our ears means we're out of time. Hey, I thank you for joining us. The show airs every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. You get your questions answered live. You can join us in the chat room. There's a bunch of stuff that happens before and after the show that you can check out. But if you don't, head over to AskNoahShow.com, podcast.AskNoahShow.com. That's where you'll find the show notes, the articles and references we use to make the episode. We're back next Tuesday. AskNoahShow.com.